Before using any machine in the shop, you should read and understand the owner's manuals. We're going to take a look at our fixed base router. The fixed base router is a unit that is hand operated. It's got two handles, so you should have two hands on there when operating it. It holds a bit and will cut into your workpiece. Now this particular unit is the exact same unit we have mounted on the router table. So on the router table it sits upside down like this, and that is the same unit that we have. So these motors are interchangeable. You could take a motor from the router table and put it in the fixed base, or in the fixed base and put it in the router table. So we're going to install some bits on here, and we're first going to talk about a couple different kinds of bits. And so we have bits to look at. We have some typical router bit that you identify typically has a bearing on the end, and that's one way you can easily distinguish a router bit from like a drill bit or other kind of bit, is that bearing. And that guide bearing allows you to ride along the edge of a workpiece, and that will set your depth. So if we're cutting into this workpiece, that bearing is going to ride right along the workpiece edge so that that cutter can only go in so far. There are other types of bits that don't have any bearings, like here's an example, no bearing on there whatsoever. And so this needs some kind of straight edge or fence when cutting to try to get a straight cut. If you don't have a straight edge or a fence, you're going to be freehand cutting, and you're not going to be having as straight a cuts as you would otherwise. Here's another bit without a bearing. This one kind of looks like a drill bit, but it is a router bit. Just got some flutes in there to take your material out. And here's another one that has a bearing, but the bearing is on the top side. So the original one I showed you, the bearing's on the bottom of the bit when you're cutting. This one, the bearing's going to be on top of the bit when you're cutting. Still, it allows you to follow along an edge. So this would be more for flush trimming one piece to another. So if you had two pieces stacked on top, this bearing would ride on the first piece and then cut your bottom piece to that size. So that's an option for bits as well. When we talk about our bits, we also have two different shank sizes. So we have a 1/4 inch shank and a 1/2 inch shank. And so you need to be able to identify those so you can get the right size collet to hold your bit in place. Before we install the bit, we wanted to look at it and make sure that the cutter looks like it's in good condition. We don't want to use a blade that's cracked or chipped. If it's got broken carbide, that could become some shrapnel as it's spinning around. There's a bad spot in that blade right in there. And then the other thing you want to do is grab the bearing and spin the bit by hand. The bit should spin pretty freely on that bearing. If that bearing is not spinning and is seized up, it's going to make some bad burn marks on your workpiece that will be difficult to get out of the workpiece. So you want to make sure that spins freely before installing the bit, and then check the teeth and the blades and make sure they're in good condition. So let's go ahead and install this. We're going to install this bit right now, and we're going to put that in our fixed base router. So the first thing we're going to do is locate the clamp that locks this tight, which is right here on the front, and we're going to open that up and unclamp the base there. Now there is a tab under each handle. There's a little black tab, and we need to squeeze both of those at the same time. And when we squeeze those, that will allow us to unclip from the collar here and slide the base off. So once we have the base off, we can more easily work with getting our bit installed. So we're going to take the collet all the way out, and so that should come out nice and easy. There's no tension on there, no bit in there, and we're going to take that out. And one thing we want to do before putting in our next bit is clean out the little channels that are in there. So there's these little channels or grooves cut into the collet that allow it, when it tightens up, to squeeze that bit. If those little channels are full of sawdust or other debris, that's not going to clamp our bit very well. So we want to clean those out, and to do that, just simply take your collet and tap it on the table or workpiece, and it should knock out any debris that's in there. You need to determine which size collet you need based on the shank of the bit. So we're going to use a 1/4 inch bit. We need the 1/4 inch collet. And so there's also a 1/2 inch collet for the 1/2 inch shank router bits. So you got to determine which one. If it's got the wrong one in there, you'll need to switch it out so that you have the right size. So once you've cleaned out those channels in there, we're going to go ahead and start getting that screwed back on, and it should go on pretty easy, very just finger loose as we screw it on there. Should not take a wrench or extra pressure to tighten that. Otherwise, we're going to have cross threads on there and we're going to damage the machine. So very easily that should go on. I'm going to take my bit and push it all the way down. Okay, I'm going to start to get that collet tight. Before I tighten it up though, I'm going to pull my bit up about a 1/4 inch. I don't want it bottomed out. If it's bottomed out where the bit is sitting on top of the collet nut or the shank is all the way down touching the motor, we're going to get extra vibrations. So we want to take our bit and just pull it up about a 1/4 inch, just a little bit, so that as we tighten it down, it's holding on nice and firm to just the shank, and the vibration's not going to transfer through the whole bit there. So once that's finger tight, then go ahead and get your wrenches. You're going to put 1 wrench down here on the motor and 1 wrench up here on the collet, and you should be able to tighten them up. We want to get it reasonably tight. We don't want to over tighten it. The next person should be able to undo it, but we want to get it secure so that that bit doesn't come out. So our bit is now in there secure. We're going to put our base back on, and if we look in our base, if you look inside here where this locking handle is, there's 2 pins, and those 2 pins that stick out right there need to line up with one of the 2 grooves. There's a groove here on the motor, and there's a groove on the other side on the motor. It doesn't matter which one. One of those 2 need to line up with those pins. So we're going to line them up, and it should slide right into place, and it's going to sit right on top of this black collar. And then when we push down hard enough, those little tabs are going to click into place. So I'm going to push it down, and it snaps into place. Now we're not ready to lock it into place yet because we need to set the bit height. So at this point, this is where we set the bit height, and we do that by turning this black collar around the motor. So as I turn that collar, that bit starts to raise or lower depending on which way you're turning it. So depending on how much bit you want exposed, you're going to get that lined up where you want it, and then you're going to take that locking lever and clamp it back into place so it's nice and secure. If you come up to a router and it already has a bit set in there or the height is already set, you want to make sure you check that and make sure that bit is in there securely. You want to make sure that the height is set for your parameters. Don't ever assume that any machine in the shop is set up for what you need. You as the operator need to configure the machine or the tool so that it's set for your needs. So now I got my bit in there, we're all set. We're going to talk about cutting. Now when we turn the machine on, we don't want to turn the machine on upside down like this. This isn't the way we're going to hold it. And so we want to get it into place before we turn the machine on. So we would want to get our board clamped. We should never hold the workpiece with our bare hand because as we're routering, we want to have 2 hands on the router. So I would get my machine put into place. So as I'm getting ready to cut, I'm going to have my base of my machine touching the workpiece. I'm going to have the bit pulled away so that the machine can start freely on its own and get up to speed with no load on the motor. So that way it can get to full speed, and then once I'm at full speed, I'll very gently engage the workpiece and make my cuts. When we're done cutting, we'll pull the bit away from the wood so that it can stop on its own, and then turn the machine off and let it come to a complete stop on its own. Do not flip the router over or set it on the table until the bit has come to a complete stop. When we're done running the router, we're going to make sure it has come to a complete stop, and then we're going to take and we're going to turn the router upside down on the table. This will allow it to sit evenly and not ride against that bit or cutter. We're also going to put it towards the center of the table, so if someone were to bump into it or knock it over, it's not going to fall onto the floor, but it's going to hit the table rather than hit the floor. So on a machine like this, we'll notice this particular bit has 3 cutting surfaces. There's a knife there, a knife there, and a knife there. So if this rotation of this machine were 10,000 RPM, that's going to make 30,000 cuts a minute. That's an awful lot of cuts per minute for you to react and get your finger out of the way. So be sure that you keep your hands a safe distance away from the cutter or the bit when you're working. So you'll notice that I have the board already clamped to the table, so it's not going to move as we're running our router past it. You're also going to hang the workpiece off of the table so that as our bit passes by, we don't run into the tabletop surface. So we've got it hanging off the table for the clearance of the bit. So as we look at this cutter, you'll see the way these teeth or the sharp edge is on this bit. And so I can see that the cutting surface is here, here, and here. It's going to tell me the rotation of the bit or the cut as it's cutting. So the way it spins, those sharp edges should be on the leading edge as that's spinning. So this bit, as I hold this machine in the right position, this bit is going to be rotating clockwise. That means when I'm working on my workpiece, I'm going to take my router and go counterclockwise on the outside of the board. That allows the bit to spin one direction, and I'm feeding the workpiece into the bit opposite the way it spins. If I go the same way it spins, it's going to want to kind of jerk along and grab and drag me along with it. So I have much more control if I can feed it opposite the way the bit spins. So generally speaking, on the outside of a board, the outside edge of a board, you're going to go counterclockwise on the board. Like our other machines, it is the operator's responsibility to check the power cord. You want to make sure all the prongs are there that need to be. There's no empty holes. And you want to make sure there's no breaks in the outside casing of the cord as you run your hand down there and visually inspect. Now this particular unit has a loop right here at the end, and what that does is that keeps, when we're running the router, that keeps the pressure from bending right here and breaking the cord. It's got a dowel in here for some support. It loops it around, so my pressure on my cord is back here at the end. That way, if it starts to get weak and break, it doesn't break right next to the housing here. We've checked the cord. The last thing before we plug it in is we want to make sure it's in the off position. So this particular unit has a little toggle switch under this little dormer looking thing. There's on and off. We want to make sure it's in the off position before we plug the machine in. We don't want to plug it in and have this machine take off on us. So now we can plug it in. I'm going to get the tool ready. I'm going to line it up. Remember, the base is touching, but the bit is pulled away. Now, for you to be able to see while you're cutting, you can look right down here through this opening and you can see the bit. It's also got this clear plate on the bottom, so you can kind of see through there to see what you're cutting. So you can look in through this side or through the back side in that same position to see what you're doing. So we'll pull the bit away, turn the machine on, let it get to full speed. Pull it away when you let it stop and let the machine stop on its own. Wait for it to come to a complete stop before you turn it upside down and set it towards the center of the table. Now, I ran this cut twice, and the way to think about that is the first pass is removing the bulk of the material. So the first pass is doing a lot of the work, getting that extra material out of there. The second pass, I'm making sure my bearing is right along the edge of the board, and then it's going to make a finish cut and make sure that's nice and flush or even the whole way when we cut. Anytime we're working on wood, we always want to cut our end grains first. Our end grains are going to chip out on the end of the workpiece, And then if we come back with the grain, that's going to clean it up and allow us to get rid of those chips. Here's an example of doing the end grain first, and we get some chips or blowout on the back side. So that blowout kind of destroys the edge of the wood, but now when we come and go with the grain down this edge, it's going to take all those chips out of there. If we were to come with the grain first, we'd have a nice crisp edge, and then when we come across there, it's going to blow out on us. So we always want to do the end grain of the board first. So you'll notice the bit is away from the workpiece. I'm going to turn it on. When you're working your router around the workpiece, we got to be careful that we keep the base flat along the workpiece. If we allow the router to rock one way or the other, we're going to have a cut that is not nice and even. It's either going to cut in more than we want it to, or it's not going to be nice and flat. So you got to make sure that that base stays nice and flat on the workpiece as we go around the edge of the board. When you're all done using the router, we want to make sure we take the bit out, and before we do that, we want to make sure it is unplugged and that plug is somewhere in your control so your fingers don't get damaged. We're going to take this back apart, so we're going to undo the clamp and squeeze the tabs, one on each side that's under the handle, and that top should pop off. Now we can get our wrenches on here and we can start loosening the bit. So 2 wrenches, one on the motor and one up on the collet. And we're going to loosen that. Now this has a safety feature on here. The collet gets finger loose after that first initial release, but it's not loose enough that the bit will come out. So we need to get back on there with the wrench and loosen it one more time. And then after that next release, then we'll be able to take the bit out. So we're going to put the base back on and put this over on the tool wall. And we're going to take our bit and put this back on the storage rack. We'll also hang our wrenches up at this time as well. So we're here at the tool wall. We have a spot for 2 fixed base routers. We have our wrenches to adjust the machines over on the left side. We have our bits on our racks here, different bits. Just put your bit in there. They're not in really any particular order. And then on the right side of the bits, you'll notice that there is some collets hanging on the side. And those collets are there for you to switch out. If you have a different size shank bit, you can swap those out and just hang yours up over here. The next tool we're going to take a look at is another router. This is called a plunge router. And the plunge router will allow you to make plunge cuts where you would cut into the center of the board, make your cut, and then come back out. So you're not actually exiting a board when you're making your cuts. So the plunge router has a base that allows you to plunge up and down and into your workpiece. Now the plunge router is more versatile than the fixed base router. So if you had the option to buy one or the other, the plunge router can do everything the fixed base router can and more. So that would be an option. If you have the chance to get a fixed or a plunge router, you would want to take that opportunity because it can do more things. So unlike our other machine, this base does not come off of the unit. So we have to work through this little opening to get our bits in and out. So we're going to take this collet out just like in our other machine, and we're going to make sure all the little channels in there are cleaned out. So if we just take that, we can tap it on the table and clean out all the sawdust. There was some sawdust that came out of there, So it's a good thing we cleaned it out, because if that stays in there, it's not going to allow us to pinch down onto the router bit very good. So we want to clean those channels out before installing a new bit. We're going to get it started back in there, and it should go pretty easily and thread on. We don't want that thread, those threads to be cross-threaded. So if that nut were not on there straight and we started tightening it down, it would get tight very quickly, and we want to make sure we can screw it on most of the way with just our fingers. Okay, when we get like we're feeling tight, we're going to take our bit. This time we're going to use a spiral flute bit here. This is a router bit, even though it kind of looks like a drill bit. And we're going to install this in. And again, I'm going to push it all the way down. But this time I'm going to make sure I don't clamp the little flutes. So I don't want my cullet to crush where these little flutes are. So I'm not going to come any closer than where the cutting edge is. So I'm going to install it all the way down in there, but make sure my cutting edge is not being crushed by the cullet. So I'm going to get that installed about where I want it. Then I'm going to take my fingers and finish tightening it up, and then I'm going to get on there with my wrenches and snug it down. And of course, all of this is being done while the machine is unplugged. And I'm going to I don't need to use tons of force. I need this to be snug and secure, but I don't need it. I need to be able to, other people to get this undone when I'm done using it. So we don't want to be on there Superman tight. So now our bit's installed. We can flip the router back over. What we need to do now is set the depth of the cut. And so because this can plunge in and move during operation, we have this plunger over here on the side that's going to hit this base. And that's what's going to determine how far in we're going, is when that plunger hits the base. So if I pull down, I can look down here between the throat of the machine. So if I take a look in there, I can see where my bit is lined up to my workpiece, and I can determine if I need to move that. If I need to adjust it, I loosen this T-handle, and now I can move this ring over here on the side, and that's going to allow me to plunge in deeper or shallower, depending on what you want your cut to look like. When you get it secured in the place you want, you're going to lock that back in with that T-handle, and we should be good for our cuts. So this little ring here allows us to set multiple sizes, so we could have different sizes we could flip through. There's a little stopper that you put in there so that that plunger hits the stopper at one setting, then you could turn it and do another setting. So that's just a stop. We talked about the plunger and getting that set. Over here we have a mechanism that allows us to plunge into the workpiece and set this so we don't have to plunge so far. So we could have this push down so that each time we don't have to plunge very far. We could just plunge in a little bit, and then that stopper allows it, or keeps it from coming back up if you don't want that movement of plunging so far each time. If we take a look at the back side, okay, one other thing up here is this machine is variable speed, and this variable speed is set with a dial. So you would use this little dial here to turn it down to a slower speed. You want a little bit more control and more time to work. Or you could set it up on a higher speed. You're trying to remove a lot of material quickly. The faster speed is going to be a better option for you. So if we turn this around to the back side, there's a couple things over here we notice. We can see the on-off switch a little bit better. And so if you read in closely, it does say on is up and down is off. Another way I like to think about it is if I'm using this and my hand slips and I bump down, I am going to be turning it off. So down is off. When we're cutting, we want our cuts to be nice and uniform. So we're going to plunge this into the workpiece and use this little locking lever here to lock it in place. Then we would work around our cut, and when we're done, we'll unlock it. So you don't want to crank on this lever too hard, because if you do it super hard, you're in the middle of a cut and now you want to undo it. You've got to fiddle with this a lot to get it to come undone. So when you plunge down, it really does not take a lot of pressure. Shouldn't take more than one finger or so to push on that to lock it in place. You'd make your cut again, and when you're done, you unplunge it before turning it off. This allows the motor to stop on its own without a load on the motor, and it comes to a complete stop on its own. Do not let go of the unit until the machine has come to a complete stop. Just because you're done operating, we don't want to let go because the vibration of it still spinning could cause it to fall off and hit the floor. Someone could bump into the bit if it's unattended. So we don't want to let go until it comes to a complete stop. Like my other machines that we use in the shop, we want to check the power cord. It's your responsibility as the operator to make sure the cords are all in good condition before you use it. Make sure the prongs are all there that need to be. This one only has 2 prongs. So we're good there, nothing is missing, and the prongs look in good shape. Then you can go ahead and plug the unit in. So we've got it plugged in. As we're operating, we need to watch the cord to make sure it's out of the way. We don't want to run into that cord and get shocked or damage the cord. Okay, I'm going to have the machine turn like this, so my handles, on-off switch and lever is here for my easy access. I'm going to turn it on. This motor has a little bit more torque behind it because it is a bigger unit, a bigger motor. So I'm going to turn it on, let it get to full speed before I plunge down into the workpiece. Now once I've plunged in, I only have this little area down here to view what I'm cutting or what I'm doing. Remember, there's no bearing on this bit, so that means we're not going to get a straight cut unless we have some kind of guide or straight edge. Today we're going to do some freehand cutting. So we'll turn it on. Need to hold on to it till it comes to a complete stop. And I made a very lazy figure 8 there on the board. Okay, so we can plunge in, we can make some cuts and plunge back out. You could use this for making signs, for relieving out material that you don't want there. Maybe you want to recess for some reason. This bit or this machine would work well for that. Like our other routers, we're going to make sure the machine is unplugged before we change the bit. So we're going to take the bit out so we can store this. Typically, we don't want to store the router with the bit in the machine. So I'm going to set the cord somewhere where I have control of it so nobody accidentally plugs it in. And I'm going to get my 2 wrenches back out and we're going to take this bit out. So I'm going to get one on the motor and one on the collet and loosen that up. It's going to get finger loose there. I'm going to turn it a couple times till it gets tight again. Then I'm going to get my wrench back on the collet and loosen it for the final time. And now it's finger loose and I can pull the bit out of the machine. So we're going to put the bit back on the wall. We're going to wind up the cord on the machine and put the wrenches away along with the machine, put that back on the tool wall. If you have any questions on how to operate this machine or any other machine in the shop, please talk to your instructor so we can get those questions or issues answered.